Good evening, everybody. Well, thank you for being there first. And of course, I should express my gratitude as well to Jose Maria and Benoit, who have been helping us through the process of putting together our presentations for the conference, which, as most things this year, is going to be unusual, online, of course. So, as I said, thank you for being there. As my poster at the beginning of the presentation clearly shows, the presentation is going to be on a short piece of fiction by Sherman Alexie, a well-known American Indian writer. Lately, he's been in trouble, as some of you may know, but he's one of the best-known voices among Native Americans, at least in the last 2 decades. Yes, the story, the Sin Eaters. Well, there are 2 main points that I want to make in my presentation. First, the first one is that it appeared, and my first part of the presentation will refer precisely to the genesis of the story, how it originated, but also why Alexie decided to include it in the collection, The Toughest Indian in the World. Yeah, so I'll say something about that, but of course, my efforts will concentrate mostly on showing how it can be considered a dystopian piece of fiction, which, if we take into account everything that Alexie has produced, is a bit unusual, because he's very much in favor of a realist type of fiction, primarily because of his over concern about how Indians have been stereotyped and fictionalized, particularly in authors and in films, of course, by white authors. So the corpus of my presentation, as you can see there, will very much deal with the main dystopic elements in the story, and I will also pay some attention to the narrator of the story. While I am talking, you are able to read and to see some of the visual stuff that I am using in the PowerPoint presentation, because it may illustrate, the same as the quotations from the story, that I will be using some of the points that I am making in the presentation. So without further to do, let's move to that genesis of the story, which, as I said, very clearly deals with the genocide, primarily cultural, but we could speak of other types of the political, economic, all those other dimensions that usually a genocide involves. As I said, although the story was published at the turn of the century, yes, of the beginning of the 21st century, it had originated a bit earlier, yes, and it was while Alexie was writing Reservation Blues, an earlier novel, that he had thought of producing a novel under the title of the Sin Eaters. The author has expressed now his ideal of producing this novel, because he found the topic really and the tone that he uses in the short story very captivating, and rather also, I would say, in his political agenda rather important. But as he began to write the story, he realized that to maintain the kind of outwardly and sinister tone of the story would be difficult. So he often refers to it as a kind of failed novel, because precisely of the kind of distress that he felt while he was writing it. There are plenty of examples in the story where very, as I said, dark and sinister images appear. I could give you a couple of examples, no? In quotation number 17 of the handout, for instance, we read, we were forced into cattle chutes and led from station to station. At the first station, we were shaved bald. I was shaved bald by a white woman. I looked into her eyes and blah, blah, blah. No, there later in the next station, stripped of their clothes, old men and women, young boys and young girls, powerfully built fathers and beautiful mothers, all naked. So, and then we find that sickly people are led away, and of course it is a point of concern to the narrator where these co-ethnics, where these Indians are being taken through the narrative. So the idea here is that Alexie had serious difficulties to turn it into a novel, and that, and this is the next slide, within the context of the book, of the short story collection, The Toughest Indian in the World, it is a kind of the odd man out, in the sense that while most of the stories in this collection deal with contemporary Indians that have difficulties, but are not, of course, confronted with a genocide. Yes, in contemporary cities, yes, the case of the sin eaters is very different. So Alexie's argument was that what he was trying to do by inserting this story in The Toughest Indian in the World was to, for it to act as a kind of counterpoint or counterweight to these more optimistic stories that he's telling us about, sometimes even yuppie Indians who succeed in their law or economic careers in cities of mostly the American Northwest. Yes, the story proper is set in the past, which is a bit unusual for a dystopian fiction. Yes, we hear at the beginning of the story that in fact the action takes place. We read those were the days before the first color televisions were smuggled onto the reservation. But after the man with blue eyes had dropped two symmetrical slices of the sun on Japan. So that's a reference to World War II, yes, and how Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed by the American government. All of it happened before a handsome Catholic was assassinated in Dallas, and that reference is also very clear. So we can assume now that the story takes place somewhere between World War II and the assassination of Kennedy, probably somewhere in the 50s, when the US government, of course, was dealing with what was still being called the Indian problem, yes? And there were all kinds of acts that were being passed, yes, either to relocate Indians or to terminate with certain tribes. So intimately related to this idea of the vanishing Indian, no? Of Indians being in some cases displaced, in other cases dispossessed of their little sovereignty up to that point. So this was probably Alexie's major concern when he inserted this more negative, and thus the sense of my title, this more negative picture of what the history of Native Americans had been within the context of the nation. Okay, so the story takes place on or begins now, because then they are moved to military facilities, but it begins on a quiet Spokane reservation in the state, in Washington state, and of course the first things that we see is the invasion of the place. So quotation number 7, for instance, tells us, together my parents and I stepped into our front yard and stared up into the sky. We saw the big planes roar noisily through the rough air above the reservation. We saw the soldiers step from the bellies of those planes and drop toward the earth. We saw 1,000 parachutes open in 1,000 green blossoms. all over the Spokane Indian Reservation, all over every reservation in the country, these green blossoms fell onto empty fields, onto powwow grounds, and onto the roofs of tribal schools and health clinics. Yes. So basically, the idea is all reservations around the country are being invaded. Yes. The people living there are going to be pulled out, no, taken away, and transported to usually desert places where they are processed, as it were, in military facilities, and they're going to be used as subjects in different types of experiments. So, as I said, no, there are very clearly these topic elements in the story. In fact, several authors have compared the scene either to the well-known novel by Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale. Yes, because in this case, it is not sexuality or gender that seems to be important, but rather ethnicity. But this whole population of Indians of different, no, the quotas of blood that they have are different, and in fact, they're classified according to how much Indian blood they have, because some of them seem to be more usable than others. So from the very beginning of the story, it is clear, and it has already become evident in how they were treated, that there are echoes, no, sorry, of the Nazi Holocaust, yes, during the Second World War. Much of the imagery that comes up, no, there are references to Anne Frank and to other important figures during that catastrophic chapter of human history. So there is a clear profusion now of images that immediately bring to our mind the idea of a whole contingent, a whole segment of the population being transported and concentrated in some sort of camp, and then being used for different types of experiments. Yes, although there is no clear explanation to why this is being done to the Indians. The author himself, in some interviews, explained now that some sort of illness or some sort of health problem was going to be solved by using Indian blood. Yeah? So in many of the quotations there are references to how despite the fact that they're being enslaved, their blood should be protected, yes, and that it shouldn't be contaminated. So it becomes a kind of precious wood, yes, that is going to be used for the benefit of the white population. So, for instance, in quotation number 9, we read about the narrator's fathers. Joseph is a full-blood Coeur d'Alene Indian. Sarah, the mother, is a full-blood Spokane. And the black soldier explains to another soldier that because they're part of an interior Salish tribe, there should be no problem with their blood being contaminated, so they're going to be usable either to cure some disease or to, in a way, improve the living conditions of the white population. Okay, so on top of these reminiscent elements now of the Holocaust and whatever, what is perhaps most interesting, and this again could be linked to what we see in The Handmaid's Tale, is the idea of governmental surveillance and control over the population. Yes, we will see that there is an overwhelming presence of the military yes, and the kind of strategies that they will be using with the Indian population in the story can be, well, they range. Now, of course, there is this kind of respect towards them because they possess something that is good to them, but at the same time, they can be extremely cruel if any of the Indians decides to to step out of the program. Very interesting what I found, and some other scholars have referred to the same point. Now that what is perhaps strongest in the story is the choice of a very young kid, Indian kid, and we know now in some of the pictures I was showing you at the beginning of the presentation, now that at least the cultural genocide has been committed very much now on the basis of processing, yes, the youngest generations of Indians and trying to assimilate to the mainstream culture. So I think choosing a spoken 12-year-old boy as we could say, representative of all of his people, well, it makes sense, but on top of that gives Alexie the possibility of using our protagonist, John, a lot in different ways. Yes, there are certain things, certain characteristics in the boy that make him particularly suitable to become that narrator and that representative of his people. I won't have time to read many more quotations, so very swiftly I will go through the last part of my presentation, reasons for the adequacy of Jonah as the right observer, the right voice to tell us now the story of what is happening to to his people. On the one hand, as I point out here, he's extremely observant, and he, although his journey in the story, yeah, it's not only physical but also mental, is traumatizing. Still, he's able to keep his poise, his composure now, and he's able to present us a very, I would say, faithful picture of what is happening to. So despite all that distress and anxiety and somehow confusion that he experiences, still he is able, not only that, but we hear from the beginning of the story, that he's an inborn and natural storyteller, and that gives him the advantage to transform in very original and creative ways some of the images that he is observing into what I would say are very significant metaphors of what was happening. Perhaps not in this very literally dystopian way that we see in the story, but in other ways to his people at this point of history. Okay, so although most of his renditions, as we read here, are rather dark and ominous, yes, and we are always, his premonitions are also very, very dark. There are also, in fact, moments of brighter moments in the story. We find even touches of humor, which are, of course, typical of Alexie himself as an author, but which in the voice of this young narrator are probably related also to the oral tradition in Native American cultures. So several critics have already pointed out and have insisted on the adequacy of this young man as a suitable narrator for the story. And to conclude, just since I only have a couple of minutes, to explain how rich the story is, because it can be approached from different perspectives and points of view. Some of them pay more attention to the historical significance of the story, which is, of course, it is not to be read literally, as I said, so it is more like a parable. It is more like metaphor of what was happening to Native Americans at the time. But at the same time, there are folkloric elements, so that approach is also possible. As I said, there are clear echoes of the Holocaust. So how is it that the Indian genocide could resemble now what happened to African Americans or to the Jews during World War II? Yeah, so I think the story is interesting, as I said at the beginning, for two important reasons. As a counterpoint to what we see in the other stories of the collection, offering the underside, yes, of what was happening to Indians in the second half of the 20th century, but also as an important, I don't know if the term testimony could be used here, but certainly now Sabatier and some of the people that I have on my reference list, they speak of it as a dystopian piece of fiction, but one that rather than being about or just about submission, exploitation, medical exploitation, and so on and so forth, offers also some glimpses of resistance, of trying to come to terms, no? So it could be easily considered also a piece of trauma fiction in that it tries to help particularly Native Americans process the kind of historical catastrophes that they have gone through. So there you have some of the pieces of scholarship that I was keeping in mind and that I referred to. No, there are several. No, I have here a book on conversations with the author, but there were also academic articles on the collection as a whole, but also on the Cinedas much more specifically. So to conclude, thank you for being there. Of course, I will be more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. And as I said, it has been a real pleasure, yes, to participate in this event. So thank you very much for being there.